Female CEO mocked a black mechanic, "Fix this engine and I'll marry you," then he did. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Sterling Automotive Corporation when Marcus Thompson walked through the executive entrance for the first time. His work boots made unfamiliar sounds against the polished surface, sounds that drew stares from every employee he passed. The security guard at the front desk looked him up and down twice before checking his visitor badge again. Marcus could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on his shoulders like an invisible burden he had carried his entire life. His oil-stained coveralls told a story they thought they understood completely. They saw a mechanic who had gotten lost on his way to the service garage. They saw someone who didn't belong in their world of pressed suits and expensive cologne. What they didn't see was the man who had just been specifically requested by their board of directors to examine the most expensive piece of machinery their company had ever purchased. Victoria Sterling stood at the window of the 20th floor boardroom, watching the city below with the satisfied expression of someone who had conquered everything she surveyed. At 35 years old, she had built Sterling Automotive from a small family dealership into one of the largest luxury car importers on the East Coast. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon that matched the precision of her charcoal Armani suit. Every detail of her appearance had been carefully calculated to project power and control. She had learned early in her career that respect was something you took, not something you earned. The clicking of her Louboutin heels against the marble had become a sound that made junior executives scatter like frightened birds. She turned from the window as her assistant knocked on the door, announcing that the mechanic had arrived. Victoria's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She had been forced to call this man by her board of directors after their new $12 million prototype engine had failed every diagnostic test their team of engineers had run. The board had heard about Marcus Thompson through industry whispers, stories of a mechanic who could diagnose problems that stumped even the most sophisticated computer systems. Victoria found the entire situation insulting. She had 3 MIT graduates on her engineering team, and now she was being forced to bring in someone who probably hadn't even finished high school. Marcus entered the boardroom with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that confidence didn't require announcements. His hands were clean but permanently stained from years of working with engines, telling the story of countless hours spent solving problems that others had given up on. He had been fixing cars since he was 12 years old, learning from his father in their small garage in Detroit. His father had taught him that engines were like people, each one had its own personality, its own way of communicating what was wrong. You just had to know how to listen. While other kids were playing video games, Marcus was learning to hear the subtle differences between a worn bearing and a failing gasket. By the time he was 18, people were bringing cars from 3 states away just to have him look at them. He never went to college because his mother got sick during his senior year of high school, and someone had to keep the garage running. But Marcus had never stopped learning, reading every technical manual he could find, studying engineering principles late into the night after the garage closed. He understood machines in a way that transcended formal education, possessed an intuition that couldn't be taught in any classroom. Victoria didn't stand when Marcus entered, a deliberate slight that everyone in the room noticed. 20 executives sat around the massive conference table, their eyes moving between Victoria and Marcus like spectators at a tennis match waiting for the first serve. The prototype engine sat at the center of the table, gleaming under the fluorescent lights like a technological jewel. It was supposed to revolutionize the luxury car market, providing unprecedented power while meeting the strictest environmental standards. Instead, it had become a $12 million paperweight that threatened to bankrupt the company if they couldn't deliver it to their clients by the end of the month. Victoria's voice cut through the silence like a blade, cold and sharp with barely concealed contempt. "So you're the miracle worker everyone keeps talking about," she said, making air quotes around the words miracle worker. "Let me be very clear about something, Mr. Thompson. I don't believe in miracles, and I don't believe that someone like you can solve a problem that my team of highly educated engineers couldn't fix." She stood slowly, walking around the table until she was standing directly in front of Marcus, close enough that he could smell her expensive perfume mixing with her disdain. The room held its breath as Victoria continued her performance, playing to an audience of executives who had learned to never challenge her authority. "You know what I think," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. I think this is all some elaborate waste of time. But since my board insists on humoring this charade, let's make it interesting. She paused for dramatic effect, making sure every phone in the room was recording what she was about to say. Fix this engine, and I'll marry you, she announced, her laughter sharp and cruel. That's how confident I am that you're going to fail. When you can't fix it, and we all know you won't be able to, I want you to. Admit in front of everyone here that you're nothing but a glorified grease monkey who got lucky a few times. The executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking away in embarrassment while others leaned forward with morbid curiosity. This was Victoria at her worst, the side of her that had earned her the whispered nickname, the Ice Queen, among employees who had learned to fear her more than respect her. Marcus stood perfectly still during Victoria's tirade, his expression never changing. He had heard variations of this speech his entire life, from guidance counselors who told him he wasn't college material to loan officers who laughed when he tried to expand his father's garage. He had learned long ago that the best response to this kind of cruelty was competence. His father had taught him that lesson while they worked side by side in the sweltering heat of their Detroit garage. They can take everything from you, his father had said, but they can't take what you know. They can't take your skill. And when their expensive toys break, they'll come looking for you, no matter how much they hate having to do it. Marcus looked past Victoria to the engine on the table, and something in his expression changed. It was the look of someone who had just heard a familiar voice in a crowd of strangers. He walked past Victoria without acknowledging her challenge, moving toward the engine with the purposeful stride of someone who had forgotten everyone else in the room existed. The engine was a masterpiece of modern engineering, at least on paper. Every component had been designed using the most advanced computer modeling available. The specifications were flawless, the materials were the highest quality money could buy, and the assembly had been performed by robots with precision measured in fractions of millimeters. But as Marcus placed his hands on the engine block, he could feel what the computers couldn't detect. There was a disharmony in the metal, a subtle vibration that spoke of forces working against each other instead of in concert. He closed his eyes and let his hands read the engine like Braille, feeling for the story it was trying to tell. The room watched in silence as Marcus began to work, his movements deliberate and precise. He didn't immediately reach for the diagnostic computers that the engineers had been relying on. Instead, he started with his senses, listening to the sound the engine made when he gently tapped different components, feeling for temperature variations that shouldn't exist in a cold engine, even smelling for the subtle hints of metal stress that preceded failure. After 10 minutes of examination, Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm and professional despite the hostility he had faced. Your engineers were trying to solve the wrong problem, he said, still not looking at Victoria. They assumed the issue was in the combustion system because that's where the computer said the failure was occurring. But the computer can only report what its sensors detect, and your sensors aren't placed to detect the real problem. He moved to a small component near the base of the engine, something that looked insignificant compared to the massive machinery surrounding it. This harmonics dampener is installed backward, he continued, his fingers tracing the almost invisible mounting brackets. It's a simple mistake that anyone could make because the part is symmetrical. It looks right either way. But installed backward, it amplifies vibrations instead of dampening them. Those amplified vibrations travel through the engine block and create resonance patterns that confuse the combustion sensors. The computer thinks the engine is misfiring when really it's just detecting the echo of vibrations that shouldn't exist. The lead engineer, a young man named David Chen who had graduated at the top of his MIT class, stepped forward to examine what Marcus was indicating. His face went pale as he realized the implications of such a simple error. Marcus began to work on the engine with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times before. His tools seemed to be extensions of his hands, each movement flowing into the next without hesitation. The executives watched in fascination as he carefully removed the harmonics dampener, a part that cost less than $50 but had somehow brought a $12 million engine to its knees. As he worked, Marcus explained what he was doing, his voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher. The thing about complex systems, he said, is that they're only as strong as their weakest component. You can have the most advanced technology in the world, but if one small part is wrong, the whole system fails. The engineers were so focused on the sophisticated components that they overlooked the simple ones. He paused to clean the mounting surface with a precision that spoke of years of practice. My father used to say that the difference between a good mechanic and a great one isn't what they know, it's what they notice. Anyone can follow a diagnostic manual. But to really understand a machine, you have to respect it enough to listen to everything it's trying to tell you, not just the parts you think are important. The reinstallation of the dampener took less than 5 minutes, but Marcus spent another 20 minutes making tiny adjustments to surrounding components that had been affected by weeks of irregular vibrations. He worked with the concentration of a surgeon, aware that every eye in the room was on him but focused only on the task at hand. When he finally stepped back, the silence in the boardroom was absolute. David Chin moved to the diagnostic computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he initiated the startup sequence that had failed dozens of times before. The engine roared to life with a smooth, powerful purr that sounded like music to everyone who understood what it meant. The diagnostic readings were perfect, every indicator showing green, every measurement within optimal parameters. The engine ran for 5 minutes, then 10, then 20 without a single hiccup. The impossible had been made to look easy by someone who Victoria had dismissed as unworthy of respect. Victoria stood frozen by the window, her reflection in the glass showing a woman whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. The challenge she had thrown out as a cruel joke now hung in the air like a signed contract. The other executives were already pulling out their phones, and she knew that within hours, the story would be all over the industry. The mighty Victoria Sterling, brought down by her own arrogance. But what happened next surprised everyone, including Marcus. David Chin stepped forward and addressed the room, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to say. "I need everyone to understand something," he began, looking directly at Victoria. "What Mr. Thompson just did required a level of understanding that goes beyond anything they teach in engineering school. He diagnosed in 30 minutes what my team couldn't figure out in 3 weeks. And he did it without running a single computer diagnostic." David turned to face Marcus directly. "Sir, I would be honored to learn from you. Whatever Sterling Automotive is paying you, it's not enough." The boardroom erupted in conversation as executives began discussing the implications of what they had just witnessed. The board members who had insisted on bringing Marcus in exchanged knowing looks, their gamble having paid off in ways they hadn't expected. But through all the chaos, Marcus remained calm, his attention still on the purring engine. He had done what he came to do, solved the problem that needed solving. The rest was just noise. Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out smaller than anyone had ever heard it. "How?" she asked, the single word carrying the weight of her shattered pride. "How did you know?" Marcus finally looked at her, and there was no triumph in his eyes, only a quiet sadness for someone who had spent so much energy building walls between herself and the rest of the world. "I knew because I've spent my entire life fixing things that other people broke," he said simply. "Sometimes those things are engines. Sometimes they're situations. And sometimes they're people's assumptions about what someone like me is capable of." The weight of Marcus's words settled over the room like a heavy blanket, making everyone uncomfortably aware of their own prejudices. Victoria's assistant, a young woman named Jennifer who had worked for her for 2 years, cleared her throat nervously. "Ms. Sterling," she said quietly, "the board is requesting an immediate meeting. They're all on the conference line." Victoria's face went even paler, if that was possible. She knew what this meant. The board had been watching, had seen everything, and now there would be consequences. She had exposed the company to potential lawsuits, had created a hostile work environment, and had embarrassed them in front of someone they desperately needed. Her challenge about marriage could be construed as harassment, and in the current climate, that was a death sentence for an executive career. But more than that, she had been wrong. Completely, utterly, and publicly wrong about something that mattered. The next hour passed in a blur of phone calls and hastily arranged meetings. Lawyers were consulted, human resources policies were reviewed, and damage control strategies were discussed. Through it all, Marcus sat quietly in a corner of the boardroom, drinking coffee that Jennifer had brought him and watching the corporate machinery struggle to process what had happened. He had seen this dance before, the panic that set in when powerful people realized they had made a mistake that couldn't be buried or bought away. His phone buzzed with messages from other companies who had somehow already heard about what happened, offering him consulting contracts and full-time positions. The automotive world was smaller than people realized, and news traveled fast when someone made Victoria Sterling eat her words. But Marcus wasn't interested in capitalizing on Victoria's humiliation. He had come to fix an engine, not to destroy a career, even if that career belonged to someone who had treated him with such disrespect. As the afternoon wore on, the boardroom slowly emptied until only Marcus, Victoria, and David Chen remained. The engine continued to run perfectly on the test bench, its steady rhythm a reminder of the simple solution that had eluded everyone who had been too proud to look for it. Victoria sat slumped in her chair, her perfect posture abandoned along with her pretense of superiority. She looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of her actions had physically diminished her. David was running post-repair diagnostics, documenting everything for the technical report that would need to be filed. The numbers were remarkable. Not only was the engine running, but it was performing at 15% above its design specifications. Whatever adjustments Marcus had made had not just fixed the problem but had optimized the entire system. Finally, Victoria spoke, her voice rough from hours of difficult conversations with board members and lawyers. "I owe you an apology," she said, not quite meeting Marcus's eyes. "What I said, how I acted, it was inexcusable." Marcus set down his coffee cup and looked at her with the same steady gaze he had maintained throughout the day. "I don't need your apology," he said quietly. "But your employees do. The culture of a company comes from the top, Ms. Sterling. When you treat people as less than human based on their appearance or their job title, you give everyone else permission to do the same." That young engineer, he nodded toward David, he knew something was wrong with how your team approached the problem, but he was too afraid to speak up because he had learned that questioning authority in this company was career suicide. Victoria flinched at his words, but she didn't deny them. How could she? The evidence was overwhelming. Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "You want to know the real reason your engine failed? It wasn't the backward dampener. That was just the physical manifestation of a bigger problem. Your engine failed because your company culture values credentials over competence, arrogance over curiosity, and status over skill. Your engineers were so concerned about looking smart that they stopped trying to be smart. They ran the same diagnostics over and over, hoping for different results, because admitting they needed help would have made them look weak. And in a company where weakness is punished the way you punish it, nobody can afford to look weak." The truth of his words hung in the air like an indictment. David had stopped typing, his hands frozen over the keyboard as he absorbed what Marcus was saying. It was everything he had felt but had never been able to articulate, the toxic culture that had turned brilliant engineers into frightened yes-men. "My father taught me something when I was young," Marcus said, standing up and preparing to leave. "He said that machines are honest. They don't care about your degree or your skin color or your bank account. They either work or they don't. And if they don't work, they'll tell you exactly why if you're humble enough to listen. The problem with your company, Ms. Sterling, is that you've forgotten how to be humble. You've forgotten how to listen. And that's a problem that no mechanic can fix." He pulled a business card from his wallet and placed it on the table. "My consulting fee for today is $30,000. That's non-negotiable. But I'm going to offer you something for free. If you want this company to survive, you need to change. Not just apologize, not just go through sensitivity training, but really change. Start valuing people for what they can do, not where they come from. Create a culture where questions are welcomed, where failure is seen as learning, where the janitor's opinion is as valued as the CEO's when it comes to solving problems. Victoria looked at the business card, noting the simple design and the Detroit address. "Will you continue to consult for us?" she asked, her voice small. Marcus shook his head. "No. You have everything you need to succeed. David here is a brilliant engineer. He just needs permission to be brilliant instead of being forced to follow protocols that don't work. Your other engineers are probably just as capable. They've just been trained to be afraid. Fix your culture, and you'll fix your company. Keep running it through fear and intimidation, and you'll be bankrupt within 2 years, no matter how many engines I fix for you." He turned to David and extended his hand. "It was a pleasure working with you. Trust your instincts. They're better than you think." David shook his hand firmly, gratitude evident in his eyes. "Thank you, sir. For everything." As Marcus walked toward the door, Victoria called out one last time. "The marriage thing," she said, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I know it was a cruel joke, but technically." Marcus turned back with a slight smile, the first one anyone had seen from him all day. "Miss Sterling, I'm already married. Have been for 15 years. My wife is a doctor at Detroit General. She's the one who encouraged me to come here today, even though I knew what I'd be walking into. She said that sometimes you have to show people what they're missing by being too proud to see it. Besides," he added, his smile widening slightly, "I prefer partners who see me as an equal, not as someone beneath them who needs to prove their worth." The reference to her challenge hung in the air, a final reminder of how badly she had misjudged not just Marcus's abilities but his character. Marcus left the building the same way he had entered, with quiet dignity and purpose. But the ripples of his presence continued long after he was gone. Within a week, Victoria had resigned as CEO, accepting a lesser position that would allow her to remain with the company but removed her from direct leadership. David Chen was promoted to head of engineering with a mandate to reform the department's culture. The story of what happened in that boardroom spread throughout the industry, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of arrogance and the importance of recognizing talent wherever it might be found. Sterling Automotive not only delivered their prototype engine on time but went on to develop an entire line of revolutionary engines based on the principles Marcus had demonstrated that day. They instituted a new policy where any employee, regardless of position, could submit ideas for consideration, and some of their best innovations came from unexpected sources. 6 months later, David Chen flew to Detroit to personally deliver a plaque to Marcus's garage. It was a recognition of excellence from Sterling Automotive, along with a standing offer for consultation at whatever price Marcus deemed fair. He found Marcus under the hood of a 1967 Camaro, his hands covered in grease, completely in his element. "You changed our entire company," David told him, watching as Marcus carefully adjusted a carburetor. "Victoria is a different person now. She personally mentors young engineers from disadvantaged backgrounds. She says you taught her that talent doesn't always come in expected packages." Marcus wiped his hands on a rag and looked at the plaque with quiet satisfaction. "I didn't change anything," he said simply. "I just fixed an engine. Everything else, that was all of you finally deciding to listen to what was right in front of you all along." The Camaro's engine roared to life, filling the garage with the sound of American muscle properly tuned. David stood there for a moment, listening to the perfect rhythm of the engine, understanding finally what Marcus had meant about machines being honest. They really did tell you everything you needed to know if you were humble enough to listen. As he prepared to leave, David asked one final question. "Do you regret not taking a permanent position with us? The money would have been life-changing." Marcus looked around his garage, at the cars waiting to be fixed, at the pictures on the wall of satisfied customers, at the certificate from the city recognizing his garage as a vital community service. "This is my life," he said simply. "And it's already perfect." Sometimes the best thing you can do for people isn't to join them but to remind them that there's more than one way to be successful, more than one way to be valuable, more than one way to matter. The title of this story, "Female CEO Mocked a Black Mechanic," "Fix this engine and I'll marry you, then he did," became more than just a headline. It became a reminder that competence doesn't require credentials, that wisdom doesn't always come from universities, and that the most valuable lessons often come from the people we're quickest to dismiss. Marcus Thompson continued to run his garage in Detroit, turning down offers from Fortune 500 companies to maintain his independence and his connection to his community. He became a legend in the automotive world, not because he sought fame but because he refused to let anyone make him feel less than what he was, a master of his craft who understood that true expertise transcends any barrier society tries to erect. And Victoria Sterling, the woman who had mocked him, became one of his strongest advocates, using her platform to promote diversity and inclusion in the automotive industry, always telling the story of the mechanic who taught her that pride comes before a fall, but humility can help you rise again. Years later, when business schools taught the case study of Sterling Automotive's transformation, they focused not on the technical aspects of the engine repair but on the human element. How one man's quiet dignity in the face of disrespect had sparked a complete cultural revolution in a company that had been dying from the inside out. They taught that innovation doesn't always come from the top, that solutions often come from unexpected sources, and that the most dangerous thing a leader can do is assume they know everything. Marcus Thompson never sought credit for the changes his visit had sparked, but everyone who knew the story understood that he had fixed much more than an engine that day. He had fixed a broken culture, challenged ingrained prejudices, and proved that excellence speaks louder than any degree or title ever could. And in the end, that was worth more than any job offer or consulting fee. It was worth the respect that had been denied to him for so long, finally given freely by people who had learned to see beyond their own assumptions. The garage in Detroit still stands, still run by Marcus Thompson, still fixing problems that others have given up on. But now it's also a pilgrimage site of sorts for engineers and executives who want to understand what they missed in their formal education. Marcus welcomes them all, teaching them the same lessons his father taught him about listening to machines and respecting the knowledge that comes from experience rather than textbooks. And somewhere in a gleaming office building, Victoria Sterling keeps a photo on her desk from that day in the boardroom. Not as a reminder of her humiliation, but as a reminder of her education. The day she learned that mocking someone for their appearance or background doesn't make you superior, it just makes you blind to the excellence standing right in front of you. The title of this story serves as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration, showing that sometimes the most powerful response to mockery is simply proving that you are exactly who you always knew yourself to be, regardless of what anyone else thinks. This story reminds us that in every workplace, in every interaction, we have a choice. We can judge based on appearances, or we can value based on ability. We can mock what we don't understand, or we can learn from unexpected teachers. We can maintain our prejudices, or we can allow ourselves to be transformed by recognizing the dignity and worth in every person we meet. Marcus Thompson chose to maintain his dignity in the face of disrespect. Victoria Sterling eventually chose to change rather than defend her prejudices. And Sterling Automotive chose to value competence over credentials. These choices transformed not just a company but the lives of everyone involved, proving that sometimes the most powerful engine in any organization isn't made of metal and circuits but of respect, humility, and the willingness to recognize excellence wherever it appears.